welcome everyone to the John Brown University premiere feature of Poverty in Review. I'm Zoe Ross.
And I'm Maury Phillips. This program highlights the challenges and issues of poverty. We're showcasing reports on how JBU explores the subject and how students here are affected by it.
Our first report tonight is by Ori, and afterwards we'll get a special interview with Maria Aguilar. After
interviewing Maria, we're showcasing Megan Sumpter's report on a poverty simulation held on campus in Professor Debbie Miller's Diversity and Media class.
And finally, we'll conclude with my report on how my family faced poverty while living in Minnesota.
Let's get started. I interviewed Dr. Tricia Posey, director of the Honors Scholars Program here at JBU and professor of history. She and I talked about her class on poverty. Here's that report. Dr. Posey, you are teaching a class this semester titled Poverty and Welfare in American History. All things considered, what are some of the topics you've covered in that class, and why do you believe this is an important topic for JBU students to study?
So this class is, again, Poverty and Welfare in American History. We look at a lot of things in this class. We look at the history of poverty in the United States, so what causes poverty. We look at proposed solutions to the problem of poverty. And we look at it from a lot of different perspectives, looking at it from different institutional perspectives, including the role of government, the role of business, the role of churches, the role of civic society. And in looking at all of these things, we try to understand just how complex the problem of poverty is. One of the consistent themes we look at in the United States in particular is the question of what causes poverty. Is it structural or is it individual? This is a common question that has been asked throughout U.S. history, and we look at the ways these questions have manifested themselves based on different historical contexts.
So if you had the opportunity to tell others at JBU about this class, what would you tell them?
I would say that one of the benefits of this class is that it really does help you understand more deeply the complexity of the issues related to poverty. We often see poverty in very simple terms, but if you look at the history of poverty in the United States, then you gain a much better complexity for this issue. The other thing is that because this class is taught at a Christian university, we know that Scripture has a lot to say about poverty, both its causes and how we address it. And so we do a deep dive into Scripture and what Scripture might tell us about how we might consider this issue a little more deeply.
So in your opinion, why is it important for us to think about poverty from the perspective of history?
One of the things that history gives us is, it gives us a few things. When we look at poverty today, a history perspective can help us to go back in time and to understand what are some of the root causes of the poverty that we see in the United States today. The other thing that history gives us is a deeper understanding into how responses in the past to poverty have influenced responses today in the present. And finally, it gives us, again, a much better understanding of the complexity of the problem of poverty and how historical circumstances, economic, social, political, have shaped poverty in the past. And having an understanding of those different sources of poverty, different elements that are playing into the problem of poverty, can help us to better address the issue of poverty in the present.
So what kind of takeaways do you see from your students in this class?
It's interesting because I often have students right after they've left JBU, even years after they've left JBU, talking about how the things that we've talked about in our class have influenced them in their own work and their own perspectives and their own responses to their own communities. So I see a lot of impacts coming from this class. I think one of the biggest impacts that I see, well, two big impacts. One, a greater understanding for how complicated poverty is, and how many sources there are for the problem of poverty in the United States, but also a much deeper empathy for people who live in poverty, a greater understanding of those who are experiencing poverty today.
So for a more general audience, what are some things that you wish others knew about the subject of poverty and welfare?
I think for a general audience, I would want them to understand that there are many causes of poverty, that they can come from the loss of a job, from enormous medical expenses, from challenges with transportation, to trying to address challenges of child care, food insecurity. There are so many reasons that people live in poverty, and we really need to have a better understanding of those causes in order both to address the problem of poverty, but also to have deeper empathy for those who are experiencing poverty as well.
So our class in diversity and media issues today, class poverty simulation, that was based on a more expansive community-wide event that our professor had been a part of. In the past, I know you have been a part of community poverty simulations. So what can you tell us about that type of activity, and what are some of the benefits for the individuals participating in it?
So a poverty simulation puts the participants in the position of being someone who's lived in or living in poverty. What a poverty simulation does is it sets you up with a certain sort of family dynamic and family structure at the beginning of the experience. So you could be a single mom with 2 kids. You could be a family, a couple with no kids. And so it sets you up in a certain family structure, and then has you go through a month's experience of trying to make it through that month with your limited means. And along the way, you face certain challenges. Your car might break down. You might have an unexpected medical expense. All the things that people who experience poverty have to go through. And you in the poverty simulation are placed in the situation where you have to make the hard decisions that someone in poverty would have to make. Do I pay for my medical bill or my rent, or do I pay for food for my children? And I think in having to make those difficult experiences, you understand the stress that people in poverty experience, and you also gain much more empathy for people who are experiencing poverty as well.
So lastly, how can knowing more about poverty and the challenges some members of our community face make us better citizens and perhaps more engaged Christians?
Scripture tells us that God cares for those who live in poverty, for those who are on the margins. Jesus himself said, if you have cared for someone who is struggling, if you have given food or shelter to someone who needs it, you have cared for me. And so there is a deep commitment in Scripture to having the people of God live out the gospel as they care for those who are experiencing need. So this is something that we ought to all deeply care about. And in order for us both to have empathy and to respond well, we need to know more. And so doing research and understanding the history, all of these things can help us to have more empathy and also more knowledge in addressing an issue that God calls all of us to care about and respond to in the Spirit of Christ.
That was such a great report by Ori. And right now I'm here with Maria Aguilar, who is the executive editor at the Threefold Advocate and is taking Dr. Posey's class. Maria also has experience facing poverty in her home country of Honduras. Maria, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh yeah, of course. So you're a communications major with an emphasis in digital journalism and a minor in political science and social justice. It's a big, big major. And part of that means you're taking Dr. Posey's class. And so I'm kind of wondering, what has this class taught you?
That's a great question. I am taking Poverty and Welfare in American History for my social justice minor. And some of the things that I have learned so far, especially being someone not from the United States, is just how this has been a very common problem and issue throughout history. So we examine the roots of the issue by looking at slavery and learning about the Great Depression and other key components of history and some of the policy behind poverty issues in the United States. So not just the cultural barriers or some of the societal factors that lead into poverty, but also just structurally how there are several systems in place that have allowed poverty to continue thriving and continue being an issue, especially in communities of people of color or other marginalized communities in the United States.
Yes, that is a really important class. And I'm also wondering, so since you have such a robust major, have you had experiences which have brought you there to social justice and learning about things like poverty?
Yes, so I think that everybody that is passionate about social justice has to somehow be acquainted or exposed to social issues in the first place. And as you had previously mentioned, I do have some of the experiences, and I have been a witness of what poverty looks like in Honduras, my home country. I come from a low to middle income background. And given my dad's experience with unemployment and immigration, I have been able to see it more firsthand. But also, just as an advocate and journalist in Honduras, I have also been able to see that more on a larger scale, understanding that poverty can be looked at in very different ways and can affect families and other people in much more complex situations than just economically. And so we are talking about people facing unfair housing situations. We're talking about people not being qualified for employment or facing joblessness, which is this state of not having a dignified wage and not being able to fulfill their basic needs. And so after seeing these in Honduras by myself as a journalist and advocate, I'm bringing these experiences back here, and I'm trying to analyze how can we help. I think that's the main question after all, and having this background in poverty and welfare in American history has also allowed me to just be able to continue my work in social justice and see how I can use my major and all of the acquired knowledge that I have gathered in the last 3.5 years and take it back home and see what happens.
Yeah, that is so great. So kind of on that note, you're learning about America's poverty and the history in that, and so you have this experience also with Honduras and more on the international side. What are some of the differences, the specific differences and similarities between the two situations?
Yeah, and that's something that we must consider. Like, we come from, or well, at least I come from a very different background in terms of culture and structural forces, which is a concept that we have used a lot in the class. And coming from like a heavily colonized background and context, and knowing that, you know, our ancestors were basically exterminated, and our culture and like heritage was also, you know, lost in the process of colonization. We come from a background where like poverty can be different given the corruption and like these imperialist ideas that have been, you know, very common in our countries. And so given that, you know, the United States doesn't have this like background of being oppressed in a cultural manner, I can see that difference even more emphasized when I'm back home and when I'm here. So I think that, you know, it's easy to explain it theoretically, but then like the only way that you can actually understand and see the difference is when you go for yourself and you talk to the people from the communities that are facing poverty. Like, poverty in Honduras can mean having no access to water, to clean water, living in the garbage dumps, having, you know, to build your own refuge, because we cannot even call it a house, you know. Like people who don't have any shoes to walk and, you know, have their feet dirty when they are, you know, going on about their lives, trying to find decent jobs and selling, you know, fruit on the street. And as a journalist, I was able to see a lot of that. People who had their houses flooded by the river embankments and facing, you know, the threat of like climate change. And those are things that we don't talk a lot often in the context of poverty. being victims of, climate change and all these other issues, which are things that we maybe don't hear a lot here in the United States, but could also definitely happen. I see poverty in the United States more of in terms of not having equal access to fair housing, not having equal access to a dignified job, or being a low-skilled worker who cannot find a job, or be profitable or marketable in the job industry because you don't have some of the technological skills that jobs nowadays require. And so it's a different context, and we could definitely weigh more on why are these the causes and some of the factors that play into that, but both are equally important and equally matter in terms of addressing the situations and how we can properly, start working toward making justice in these areas.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is, how do we help? It's hard as college students, right, to feel like we can do much, but how can we help, I guess?
Yeah, and that's the root of, the conversation. Not only how can we learn more, but also what can we actively do and practically do to help. I think that my time at JBU has been highly valuable in learning and educating myself in the context of America and how, poverty and other social issues function here. I definitely think that the main step is acknowledging that there is an issue in the first place, and that it is not only part of the system, it's not only a cultural thing, it's also part of human nature. And acknowledging that there's not gonna be full justice ever, but in learning and educating yourself, you're honoring, the fact that God gave us this planet to care for it, and it gave us one another to be in fellowship and community. And so I think that, by having the empathy and the proper care for one another to just learn about it is the first step. But then we also have other great programs at JBU, like the mission trips that the student ministries team organized for spring break or fall break, where they go and help, communities that have been affected by tornadoes or hurricanes or other natural disasters, or, mission trips that allow students to understand the immigrant experience in the United States, or learning, about the U.S.-Mexico border issue. And so we have many different ways of learning, and also different ways of exposing ourselves to the issues that happen domestically. And then another great way to connect, is learning from your peers from other countries. International students who come from countries that have also been deeply affected by poverty, and just understanding them, not labeling them or stereotyping them, but just learning, because poverty is a universal issue, and that's something that we must acknowledge. And in the long run, we can foster a platform of empathy and just being with one another and being united in trying to achieve some of the justice that we can achieve here on earth.
Yeah, that is so good. Thank you so much for all of your insight and all of the great wisdom that you've just given us here today, Maria. We appreciate you. And up next, we're going to take a look at a report by Megan Sumpter. Megan covered the poverty simulation held in Professor Debbie Miller's Diversity and Media class. Each of the students was assigned a role by Professor Miller. The role was designed to help illustrate the many complexities of living in poverty or financial stress. Megan in the simulation played a child with parents struggling to make ends meet, and she also had a mentally ill grandmother in the simulation.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Sumpter. We are here today at JBU's 2022 Poverty Simulation.
I would take a second shift.
My name is Gwenna Dye, and I was a college student paying rent with another friend of mine, and I worked at Brahms. Poverty can be anywhere around us, that even college students, especially in this generation, students who want to continue developing academically, they struggle to make ends meet also, and it's not always get help from their families, and they need to struggle in outside of school also. I think my most educational experience in the system was when I went to the bank and they gave me a loan and kept asking me for money, and small things kept piling up. I lost my job from circumstances that were not my own. I had no control over that, and just realizing that all of these things pile up really fast and get really overwhelming. I think there are a lot of resources out there. If people understand that those resources are there to help, then there's a lot of help with that. I think also as Christians, it's our job to help those in need. We can support individually, and we can help instill hope individually that no matter what, that Christ is overall, but also that we help support those who support, and help those organizations and do what we can when we don't have control over the larger systemic issues.
Alrighty, my name is Lena. My role was a grandmother in a household with my son and his wife, and then my grandchild. Hey! I think the role that I was playing in particular, considering character of the grandma that I was playing was mentally ill and was having some health issues and was having to see the doctor, I think it really raised awareness about how mental illness affects impoverished people, and how, counseling and therapy and medicine for them is that much harder to access, considering all the bills and all the expenses and how they add up, and just having to decide whether you're going to get help or not. And that's a really tough decision. It was rather educational to go to DHS is the acronym. Anyway, they actually do have resources that I had no idea about that will help, like pay for mental illness assistance for the elderly. Like, they have services for seniors and stuff. And I didn't know about that. And so I feel like we should talk about that more, Just making those resources more widely known about and more accessible. Granted, there's a lot of paperwork that goes into it that, sucks, and I wish we didn't have to do that much paperwork, but I understand we don't want resources going to people who are making it up, but at the same time, like, I so didn't know about the resources that we have that I feel like the people who are living those experiences don't know we have those resources, so just making those resources more available.
Straight to jail. Oh, my name is Debbie Miller. I'm an assistant professor of communication, and I was the one teaching the class that engaged in the poverty simulation. I based some of the backstories on my own experience, and also on the experiences of people I've met and have read about. I look forward to reading reflection papers from the students to see what they actually took away from it.
Poverty isn't just affecting the lives of those who are in it as adults, it's also affecting their children. I think children should be able to get the things that they need. I'm Megan Sumpter. Thank you.
That's a great report from Megan Sumpter. So glad she put that together.
It can be an eye-opening experience for students to go through that type of an intense simulation. Unfortunately, for people like me, life is not a simulation. Up next is my report on how my family faced poverty. Zoe Ross reporting here in St. Paul, Minnesota, right outside my childhood home. My family moved here when I was 1 year old, and shortly afterward, my brother Josh was born in this very home, as well as my brother Christian. We lived here for 14 years, me and my family of 7 people. in a one-bedroom house. Not only was the house 948 square feet in total and had mold in the basement, but it was also across from an apartment complex, always getting visits from the police due to drug dealers and prostitution. Our neighborhood was the hood of downtown St. Paul. I sat down with my parents to ask them how this all happened, how we ended up in that St. Paul house for so long, and how we got out.
Stumbled across some audio tapes with some prosperity preachers, name it, claim it, and stuff. And
that took us on a turn.
yeah, that was yeah. My background caused me to be ripe to be harvested into that particular
ideology,
interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah.
To be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were doing what they were telling us to do, but we were not getting any more income or any other blessings weren't exactly flowing financially or anything like that. We were trying to do what we were told, to step out in faith, because it was, if we had enough faith, then all this stuff would come to us. And it's not the right way to look at God and his blessings. You can't look at him as like a vending machine, but that's basically what we were being taught.
Because of the Name It Claim It church, combined with other factors like my dad changing jobs and having undiagnosed mental health problems, my parents ended up losing their apartment in Bloomington where they had me. For a short period of time, they lived with my mother's parents while my mom was pregnant with her second child. That's when they ended up in the St. Paul house, hoping it was a temporary solution.
Well, the rent was low enough and we could make ends meet. And we went through so many lean times that was a blessing to have the rent as low as it was, but it was so small. I mean, I'm thinking 900 square feet total for the house. And there's it was technically a one bedroom, really. And we had lots of kids in that one bedroom house, but we made do with what we had. But we were there so long because, we just couldn't ever get out of the hole. We couldn't ever save any money, because any money we saved through the summer, it got ate up through the winter. And so we would make ends meet throughout the year, but we just couldn't get ahead. We just, we had terrible credit, and just couldn't get out of that hole. And so we were just surviving as best as we could. That's why we were there for so long. We were just trying to survive. And then when we were basically forced out because the original landlord died, his son took over. He wasn't quite as gracious and wanted to sell the house. And so he kicked us out, and we had to find something.
In a month.
With only a month to pack up and move out, my family almost ended up homeless. But luckily, thanks to God, he provided us a new home in the city of Columbia Heights. After living in Columbia Heights for a year, we moved to this house in Forest Lake, Minnesota, where my family lived for 4 years. It was a huge upgrade. More square footage, a great location downtown, next to the lake, on the main street in fact, but it still had a lot of problems. The house was poorly insulated in the doors and windows. The basement was disgusting, full of mold, often flooded in the springtime. And the house was unlevel, to a point where if you rolled a ball from one end of the house, it would come to the center of the house. After years of struggling, last year in the summer, my parents bought their very first home in Bentonville, Arkansas. But the only reason why they were able to have money for the down payment came out of an unfortunate accident.
If it hadn't been for that car accident that I got 30 grand for, we would have never been able to buy a house.
Yeah, because we needed the big down payment.
I mean, I've been in therapy for 6 years, seen a psychiatrist for 6 years, and I'm way better than I used to be. But still, we don't have money.
Yeah.
My history has heavily impacted our ability to be financially secure.
Despite what people may tell you about the American dream, for my parents it was impossible. No matter how hard they worked, they never could get ahead. That's the way it is for many people who end up in poverty. Once you're there, it's hard to escape, and the reasons for how people end up in poverty can often be out of their control. For my father, it was an abusive childhood, which led to a list of mental health problems that set him up for failure in adulthood. Thankfully, things have turned around for them now that they have their own home and life is more stable. My parents, Emily and Dunamis, concluded with this.
It's nice to have been given those blessings, but it wasn't always easy to receive it because I just, for so long, it feels like we've been always the charity case. And it's nice to be blessed like that, and I'm thankful for everyone who blessed us through those times, but it's nice to finally not be in that place anymore. It's hard when you're in it for a long time.
It's hard to be poor.
Indeed, it is hard to be poor. Talking with Dr. Posey, Maria Aguilar, and experiencing the poverty simulation are all important ways for us to better understand this huge issue.
We hope this program has been informative and has furthered your understanding of this very complicated topic that is very present in society today.
Thank you so much for watching our program, Poverty in Review. This is Zoe Ross.
And this is Ori Phillips, signing off.
Good night.